Most Stone Age sites leave us stone, points, flakes, axes. But wood rots, grass disappears, fibers unravel, glues and poisons can survive only as faint traces. And at a handful of extraordinary archaeological sites, some of those missing materials escape destruction. What they reveal is a very different Stone Age. Perhaps stone was not the technology prehistoric people depended on most. Perhaps it is simply what survived. Number 10. Grass bedding. The floor that almost disappeared. Around 200,000 years ago, people living at Border Cave in southern Africa were doing something that normally leaves almost nothing behind. They were collecting grass and carrying it into the cave, not simply for fuel. They were laying it across parts of the floor, creating surfaces where people could sleep, sit, and work. Today, that sounds almost too ordinary to call technology. But that is exactly why it matters. A stone point attracts attention because it was deliberately shaped and because it can survive for immense spans of time. A layer of grass cannot. Under most conditions, plants decay. Insects consume them. Microorganisms break them down. Moisture and chemical processes dismantle what remains. Eventually, the bedding can disappear into the sediment beneath it. At Border Cave, microscopic plant remains preserved a different story. Researchers identified layers of grass associated with human occupation going back roughly 200,000 years. Some had been placed over ash. The people living there were not simply occupying a natural cave floor. They were modifying the place where they lived. That small distinction changes the way we should imagine an archaeological site. Walk into the cave today, and much of the prehistoric living environment is gone. We see sediment, stone artifacts, bones, ash. But when people actually lived there, the same floor may have been covered with vegetation. Tools may have rested on it. Food may have been prepared beside it. Organic objects may have been placed around it. Nearly all of that could disappear while the stone remained. And that exposes the first problem in this investigation. What survives for archaeologists is not necessarily what mattered most to the people who used it. A bed of grass could affect comfort, cleanliness, and the organization of a living space every day. Yet it is far less likely to survive than a stone flake dropped beside it. Border Cave gives us a rare glimpse of that missing domestic world. But grass bedding was still relatively simple. Gather plants, carry them, arrange them. Other plant technologies required something more: selection, preparation, and careful construction. At a cave in southern Spain, some of those objects survived as well. They were containers. Number 9. Basketry. The container's time nearly erased. At Cueva de los Murciélagos in southern Spain, unusual preservation protected objects that would normally have vanished long before archaeologists could find them. Among them was basketry. Some of the plant fiber objects associated with hunter-gatherers have been dated to roughly 9,500 years ago. They were made from esparto grass. A basket may look simple once it is finished. Making one is not. Useful plants first have to be recognized and collected. The material must be prepared. Flexible elements have to be organized and interwoven so that the finished object can support weight without coming apart. The result solves a problem no stone blade can solve by itself. Carrying. Two hands can hold only so much. A container can move seeds, roots, nuts, shellfish, tools, or other materials in quantities the body could not otherwise manage conveniently. It can also keep things together, separate them, store them, move them repeatedly. That makes containers an important part of daily technology. Yet, they sit at a major disadvantage in the archaeological record. Stone can remain recognizable for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. Plant fiber usually cannot. So imagine two prehistoric objects lying side by side: a stone knife and the basket containing the material that knife was used to process. The basket rots. The knife survives. Thousands of years later, the knife becomes archaeological evidence. The container may become nothing more than a missing part of the story. At Cueva de los Murciélagos, unusually favorable conditions preserved that missing part. And what survives tells us more than the fact that baskets existed. Someone knew which plants worked. Someone understood how to prepare them. Someone had learned how flexible elements could be arranged into a stable form. And someone considered the finished container useful enough to invest time in making it. None of that knowledge is visible in a pile of stone flakes. This is where preservation begins to distort our intuition. Museums are filled with stone partly because stone survives. That visual abundance can make stone technology feel dominant. But archaeological abundance and prehistoric importance are not the same thing. A society could rely on baskets every day and leave almost none behind. It could use bags that disappear completely. It could carry equipment in woven containers that never enter the archaeological record at all. And once people knew how to manipulate plant material this carefully, another possibility opened. Fibers did not have to become baskets. They could be twisted, joined, knotted, stretched, and turned into something far more elaborate. A machine made almost entirely from material that rots. Number 8. Fishing nets. The machine's made of fiber. A fishing net is easy to underestimate. There is no sharp cutting edge, no heavy striking surface, no polished stone. Yet a functioning net is a carefully organized technological system. Flexible material has to be converted into cordage. The mesh must be formed repeatedly. Knots or loops must hold under tension. Depending on the design, one part may need to float while another sinks. And when everything works together, the net does something a single spear cannot. It controls an area. At waterlogged prehistoric sites in Northern Europe, archaeologists have occasionally recovered parts of this normally invisible technology. At Järvensuo 1 in Finland, wet conditions preserved plant and wooden materials that would usually decay. Among the finds were cordage and knots, bark objects interpreted as fishnet floats, and stone sinkers associated with organic wrapping or fiber. The importance lies in the combination. A stone weight by itself survives well. The fiber attached to it usually does not. Remove the organic material, and the same object becomes harder to interpret. Was it suspended, attached to a line, part of a net? How was it used? What other components once surrounded it? The archaeological record can preserve one durable part while losing the design that made that part useful. This problem extends beyond one site. Prehistoric net fishing is known from other exceptionally preserved finds, including the well-known Antria net from the early Holocene. But the rarity of surviving nets is itself part of the story. A net that was used repeatedly during life can become archaeologically invisible after death. Fish bones may remain. Stone weights may remain. The device that caught the fish may not. That matters because nets represent a different way of interacting with an environment. A spear targets one animal at a time. A net can intercept many animals moving through space. Its effectiveness depends on more than physical force. It depends on geometry, material knowledge, placement, and an understanding of where animals are likely to move. Yet most of that complexity is carried by fibers. And fibers are precisely what time is most likely to remove. So a community could possess sophisticated fishing technology while leaving behind only scattered hints of it. A few weights, some bones, perhaps a wooden component. Without exceptional preservation, the machine disappears. But fiber was only one fragile material prehistoric people relied upon. Another was everywhere. It could become a handle, a digging implement, a spear, a structure. Eventually, even a vehicle. Wood. At one Italian site, archaeologists recovered wooden tools, old enough to show that sophisticated woodworking reaches far deeper into prehistory than surviving wooden artifacts normally suggest. Number 7. The fire-shaped wooden tools of Poggetti Vecchi. Wood shaped with stone and fire. At Poggeti Vecchi in central Italy, excavators worked wooden objects from deposits dating to roughly 171,000 years ago. Several were made from boxwood, a dense and hard timber. These were not simply branches picked up and used without modification. Their surfaces showed deliberate working. Stone tools had shaped the wood, and evidence on the objects indicated that fire had also played a role in the manufacturing process. That matters because working dense wood is demanding. A sharp stone edge can cut and scrape it. Controlled heating can help alter the surface and remove material. Here, different technologies were working together. Stone, fire, wood. The final object was the result. Now imagine that same activity taking place somewhere with ordinary preservation. The wood disappears. 200,000 years pass. Archaeologists eventually excavate the site. What might they find? Stone tools, stone flakes, a hearth, perhaps bones. Everything durable enough to survive. The wooden product those tools were used to manufacture could be completely gone. That possibility reverses a familiar picture of the Stone Age. When we see a stone implement in a display case, it looks like the finished technology. Sometimes it was. But sometimes the stone was part of the production equipment. It was used to create another tool, and the finished tool was made from the material that disappeared. That is a very different archaeological problem. It means the surviving object may not simply be incomplete. It may represent the manufacturing process rather than the final product. Poggeti Vecchi also tells us something about material knowledge. The people making these implements understood wood well enough to select it and modify it deliberately. They combined cutting with heat. The details survive because the wood survived. Without that preservation, much of the technological sequence would have to be inferred, if it were recognized at all. And Poggeti Vecchi was not an isolated case of humans working wood. Far to the north, another site preserved wooden objects with an even more specialized purpose. They were weapons, and their discovery changed the way prehistoric hunting could be reconstructed. Number 6. The Schöningen hunting weapons. Wooden weapons preserved against the odds. Near Schöningen in Germany, waterlogged sediments preserved a collection of wooden hunting weapons that would normally have disappeared. Their survival gave archaeologists something extremely rare. Not an impression, not an indirect clue. The wooden weapons themselves. For many years, the Schöningen finds were widely described as being around 300,000 years old. More recent chronological work has challenged that estimate. Research published in 2025 placed the spear-bearing horizon closer to 200,000 years ago. The chronology has changed. The technological evidence remains. These were carefully manufactured wooden weapons. Suitable timber had been selected. The shafts were worked along their length. The finished forms were not accidental sharpened branches. They were specialized hunting equipment. And a wooden weapon contains information that disappears the moment the wood does. Its length, balance, weight, flexibility. The distribution of mass along the shaft. How it behaves in the hand. How it travels when thrown. None of these properties can be reconstructed directly from a stone flake lying nearby. Remove the wooden weapons from Schöningen, and the interpretation of the site becomes poorer immediately. Animal remains still survive. Stone artifacts remain. Signs of human activity remain. But one of the clearest pieces of evidence for how those people hunted is gone. This is preservation bias affecting more than our inventory of objects. It can affect our reconstruction of behavior. A site preserved wooden weapons might make its inhabitants look less technically capable than they actually were. And there is another reason Schöningen matters. Wooden weapons remind us that prehistoric tools were not always single material objects. The surviving archaeological categories can make technology look more separate than it really was. Stone here, bone there, wood somewhere else. In life, these materials could be combined. A stone point might be attached to a wooden shaft. Something might bind the two together. Something else might seal or reinforce the joint. When the organic parts disappear, the complete tool comes apart archaeologically. Only the most durable component survives. To build such composite objects, prehistoric craftspeople needed ways of connecting different materials. And long before metal clamps or synthetic glue, people were already manufacturing adhesives. One of them came from birch bark. Number 5. Birch tar. The glue between the surviving pieces. Birch bark is not an adhesive. It has to be transformed. When heated under suitable conditions, bark can produce a dark, sticky tar. Archaeological finds show that Neanderthals were manufacturing and using birch tar deep in the Middle Paleolithic, with evidence reaching back to around 200,000 years ago. That makes the material important for a reason beyond its age. It represents transformation. The starting material is bark. The finished product has different properties, and those properties allow separate objects to become one tool. Stone can be attached to wood. A cutting edge can gain a handle. A point can become part of a shafted weapon. But one part of the story remains uncertain. Researchers know birch tar was produced. They do not know that every prehistoric tar maker used the same method. Experimental archaeologists have demonstrated several possible ways of making it with materials available in the Paleolithic. Some methods are relatively simple. Others require more controlled heating arrangements. The ancient tar survives. The complete production process does not. That uncertainty is revealing. We sometimes possess the product while still lacking the instructions. And once the product itself degrades, even that evidence can disappear. Consider a composite tool after it is abandoned. The wooden handle begins to rot. The fiber binding weakens. The adhesive breaks down. Eventually, only the stone insert remains intact. Thousands of years later, an archaeologist excavates it. The artifact is real, but it is not necessarily the complete tool. It may be the one part time failed to destroy. That distinction matters. A stone edge held directly in the fingers behaves differently from the same edge attached to a handle. A shaft changes reach. A handle can change leverage. A composite construction can change control and how force is applied. If the organic components disappear, those functional differences become harder to see. So birch tar introduces a deeper version of the preservation problem. At first, we were losing whole objects. Grass bedding, baskets, nets, wooden tools. Now we begin losing the connections between objects. The hidden material holding a technological system together. And sometimes the thing that disappears is larger still. At a Neolithic settlement in Italy, waterlogged conditions preserved something almost absurdly vulnerable to archaeological time. 5 wooden vehicles. Canoes. Number 4. The prehistoric canoes of La Marmota. Vehicles that should have rotted away. Beneath the waters of Lake Bracciano in Italy lies the Neolithic settlement of La Marmota. Its preservation is exceptional. Wood, plant material, architecture tools, and 5 dugout canoes survived in conditions where organic objects would usually disappear. The canoes date to the 6th millennium BC, during the early Neolithic in the central Mediterranean. Each one began as a tree. Turning a tree trunk into a usable boat requires a long sequence of decisions. The right trunk has to be selected. The tree has to be felled. The interior removed. The hull shaped. Enough wood has to remain for strength, but enough has to be removed to make the vessel practical. At La Marmota, the 5 canoes were made using 4 different tree species. That tells us the builders were not dependent on a single kind of timber. They were working within a broader knowledge of wood and its properties. The site also produced unusual wooden elements connected with nautical technology. Together, the finds reveal a community in which water transport was not an abstract possibility. The boats were there. Now change one thing. Remove the waterlogged environment. The same canoes begin to decay, and the archaeological record changes dramatically. That is the paradox. A canoe may be one of the largest manufactured objects a community owns. It can carry several people, move food, move equipment, reach fishing areas, connect opposite shores, transport materials. Yet its size offers almost no protection against decay. A tiny stone flake can survive longer than the vehicle that carried its maker across a lake. This becomes especially important when archaeologists try to understand prehistoric movement. People reached islands and crossed bodies of water long before preserved boats became common archaeological finds. In many cases, some form of watercraft has to be inferred from the journey. People arrived. Therefore, something enabled the crossing. But the vehicle itself is gone. La Marmota gives us the rare opposite situation. The transportation technology survived, and its existence reminds us how easily mobility can disappear from the material record. Natural material does not mean simple technology. A tree can become a vehicle. Fibers can become cordage. Wood can become structural components. Technical sophistication lies in what people know how to do with a material, not in whether that material survives for archaeologists. But at least a canoe has a shape we can imagine. The next missing technology is much harder to see. It may survive only as molecules on the surface of a stone point. The stone was visible for 60,000 years. The most important part of the weapon was almost invisible. Number 3. Poisons projectiles. The technology hiding in chemistry. At Umhlatuzana Rock Shelter in South Africa, archaeologists had already recovered small quartz projectile points associated with the Howisson's Port period. The stone was not the mystery. The residues on it were. Researchers examined material preserved on the surfaces of several points. Chemical analysis identified plant-derived toxic compounds. The study, published in 2028-26, reported direct evidence for poison applied to microlithic arrowheads around 60,000 years ago. That discovery changes the object immediately. Without poison, a small point can be studied through its shape, its dimensions, its edge damage, its manufacture. Add a toxic substance, and the weapon becomes something else. Its effectiveness no longer depends only on the physical wound caused at impact. Chemistry becomes part of the hunting system. And chemistry requires knowledge that is exceptionally difficult for archaeology to recover. Which plants are toxic? Which parts should be collected? How should they be prepared? How should the substance be handled? How should it be applied? The answers existed in the minds and practices of the people using the technology. Those instructions do not fossilize. The plants usually decay. The preparation tools may not be recognizable. Even chemical residues can disappear. At Umhlatuzana, enough survived for modern analysis to detect what prehistoric hunters already knew. That is a very different kind of loss. When wood decays, an object disappears. When fibers rot, a structure disappears. When poison degrades, an entire body of practical knowledge can vanish, while the stone part of the weapon remains in plain sight. That creates another problem. Suppose similar stone points are recovered from two prehistoric sites. At one site, toxic residues survive. At the other, they do not. The difference does not automatically prove that only one group used poison. Absence of surviving chemistry may reflect absence of the behavior, or it may reflect preservation. Scientists have to keep those possibilities separate. The evidence at Umhlatuzana demonstrates poison use in that particular context. It does not allow poison to be added to every similar prehistoric weapon. But once direct evidence exists, a broader question becomes unavoidable. How many technologies depended on substances that archaeology is poorly equipped to preserve? Plant extracts, hide treatments, adhesives, pigments, waterproofing compounds, medicinal preparations, poisons. Some may leave traces. Others may disappear completely. The stone artifact survives. The chemistry that changed what it could do does not. By now the pattern is clear. The archaeological record can lose bedding, containers, nets, tools, weapons, vehicles, glue, even chemistry. But one tiny find from France reveals perhaps the most unsettling version of the problem. It is only a few millimeters long, yet those few millimeters point toward an entire technological industry that may once have surrounded Neanderthal life. Number 2. Neanderthal cordage, 6 millimeters of a lost industry. At Abri du Maras in France, researchers examining a stone artifact noticed something attached to its underside. Almost nothing was visible to the naked eye. A tiny fragment of fiber, about 6.2 millimeters long, roughly half a millimeter wide. Under magnification, the structure became clear. These were not simply loose plant fibers stuck to a tool. Individual fibers had been twisted into strands. Those strands had then been twisted together in the opposite direction. It was cord. The archaeological context dates to roughly 41 to 52,000 years ago and is associated with Neanderthals. The surviving fragment is tiny. The knowledge required to produce it is not. Cordage begins before the first twist. A suitable plant has to be recognized. In this case, the fibers came from the inner bark of a gymnosperm, probably a conifer. The useful material lies beneath the outer bark. It has to be accessed, separated, prepared. Then the fibers must be twisted in a controlled direction. Several elements are combined. The direction changes when they are plied together so that the finished cord resists unraveling. It looks simple only after someone already knows how to make it. And this is where 6 millimeters begin to expand into something much larger. Cord can bind a stone tool to a shaft. It can secure wooden components. It can make a handle, a snare. Several lengths of cord can form a net, a bag, a mat, a basket, a rope. And rope creates another layer of possibilities. Objects can be suspended. Loads can be tied. Materials bundled. Structures fastened. Equipment secured. The researchers studying the Abri du Maras fragment emphasized the same broader implication. Fiber technology is not represented adequately by one surviving piece of cord. Cordage enables whole classes of objects. Most of those objects are extremely unlikely to survive. This is why the find is so powerful. We have 6.2 millimeters. Now imagine everything else produced using the same knowledge. A carrying bag disappears. A net disappears. A snare disappears. Bindings decay. Rope vanishes. Mats vanish. Perhaps other objects for which we have no direct evidence vanish as well. The technology shrinks archaeologically until only a fragment remains. And if that fragment had decayed too, the knowledge would be much harder to demonstrate. That missing evidence affects more than a list of tools. Cordage implies planning. Plant knowledge, manual coordination, manufacturing sequences, and technologies built from combinations of parts. It gives us a glimpse not simply of what Neanderthals possessed, but of how misleading an archaeological assemblage can become after fragile materials are removed from it. A stone site may look like a world dominated by stone. Add cordage, and suddenly many other objects become possible. But number 1 pushes that problem much farther back. Older than the Neanderthal cord. Older than Schoningen under its revised chronology. Older than the bedding at Border Cave. At Kalambo Falls in Zambia, waterlogged sediment preserved worked wood for almost 500,000 years. And what survived was not simply a stick. 2 pieces of wood had been shaped to fit together. Number 1. Kalambo Falls. The wooden structure that should have disappeared. Kalambo Falls lies close to the modern border between Zambia and Tanzania. The archaeological site has long preserved evidence of very deep human occupation. But Recent excavations revealed something almost never encountered at this age. Worked wood, actual wooden artifacts, not stains where wood once lay, not impressions. The material itself. Among the finds were two large pieces of wood positioned across one another. The upper timber had been deliberately modified where the two met. A notch had been cut into it. Tool marks showed intentional shaping. The result allowed separate pieces of wood to fit together. Luminescence dating of the deposits placed this construction at least around 476,000 years ago, with an uncertainty of roughly 23,000 years. That places it far before the appearance of Homo sapiens. The exact hominin population responsible is not known from the wooden structure itself, but whoever made it was transforming wood structurally at an extraordinarily early date. This was more than picking up a useful branch. The shape of one piece had been altered so that it could work with another. Researchers described it as the earliest known evidence for the structural use of wood. The complete form is gone. That limitation matters. The surviving pieces do not justify reconstructing a large house or claiming a specific building where evidence does not establish one. Suggestions have included possibilities such as part of a platform, walkway, or another construction associated with the wet environment. Its exact purpose remains uncertain. But the uncertain function does not erase the confirmed technology. The wood was selected, worked, notched, and joined structurally nearly 500,000 years ago. And now the preservation problem reaches its full scale. Wood from this period almost never survives. At Kalambo Falls, persistent wet conditions help protect it from the normal processes of decay. Without those conditions, the structure would probably have vanished. Imagine the same hominins carrying out the same work on dry ground nearby. A tree is cut, wood is shaped, a notch is carved. The pieces are fitted together. The structure serves its purpose. Then it is abandoned. The wood begins to decay. Fungi attack it. Insects damage it. Weather breaks it down. The fibers collapse. Sediment moves. Thousands of years become hundreds of thousands. Eventually, archaeologists arrive. The wooden structure is gone. What may still be there? Stone. Perhaps the tools used to shape the timber. Those tools would demonstrate stoneworking. But the things some of them helped create might be completely absent. That is the extraordinary implication of Kalambo Falls. It does not prove that 500,000-year-old wooden structures existed everywhere. It does not tell us how common they were. It does not allow missing structures to be invented at sites where no evidence survives. What it does prove is that this kind of structural woodworking existed at least once, at an age when direct evidence for wood technology is extraordinarily rare. And once that possibility is demonstrated, absence becomes more difficult to interpret. The archaeological record is not a complete catalog of prehistoric technology. It is a filter. Stone passes through that filter extremely well. Wood usually does not. Grass usually does not. Fibers usually do not. Baskets usually do not. Nets usually do not. Vehicles usually do not. Adhesives may survive only in patches. Poison may survive as molecules. The knowledge behind all of them can disappear entirely. Kalambo Falls survived because in this one place, preservation interrupted the normal process. For a brief moment, the filter failed. And we can see what normally would have been erased. Once we see it, the familiar image of the Stone Age becomes much harder to maintain. Imagine a prehistoric projectile before burial. The stone point is only one part. Behind it is a wooden shaft. Between the materials may be an adhesive. Around the joint, perhaps fiber binding. On the point, in some contexts, plant-derived poison. Nearby, equipment may be carried in a woven container. Fishing may depend on cordage, nets, floats, and sinkers. At camp, people may sleep on plant bedding. Wooden implements may shape other materials. A canoe may connect one shore with another. A wooden construction may change the way people use a wet landscape. Now let time begin removing the toolkit. The poison breaks down. The binding disappears. The basket rots. The net collapses. The shaft decays. The bedding becomes part of the sediment. The canoe vanishes. The wooden structure is erased. The adhesive may become too faint to recognize. And after enough time, one material still stands out: stone. The stone is genuine evidence, but it is incomplete evidence. That does not give us permission to fill every gap with imagination. Archaeology still depends on what can be demonstrated. A missing object cannot simply be declared to have existed. That is why rare sites with extraordinary preservation matter so much. Border Cave, Yervenzuo, Cueva de los Murciélagos, La Marmota, Abri du Maras, Kalambo Falls. Each preserves a small part of a material world that usually disappears. And every time one of those materials survives, the rest of the archaeological record has to be viewed a little differently. The conclusion is not that prehistoric people possessed mysterious lost technology. It is something more useful. Their technology was materially more diverse than durable artifacts alone can show. Stone mattered, sometimes enormously, but it existed alongside wood, plants, fibres, adhesives, containers, watercraft, and chemical knowledge. The deeper we travel into prehistory, the more aggressively time removes those materials. So perhaps the term Stone Age tells us something about preservation as well as technology. We see stone because stone survives. Some of the missing world has returned through waterlogged sediment, some through dry caves, some through microscopic fibers, some through chemical residues that no human eye can see unaided. And some technologies may have disappeared so completely that archaeology has not yet recovered a single recognizable trace of them. That may be the hardest question left by all 10 discoveries. Not simply what prehistoric people made, but how much of their technological world vanished before we ever had the chance to find it.